The following is a production of the Pritzker Military Library. The stories of the men and women of the United States Armed Services and their role in the preservation of democracy are explored here by leading military historians, scholars, and authors. This is the Pritzker Military Library presents.
Welcome to the Pritzker Military Library Presents with our special guest, General Stanley McChrystal. This program is coming to you from the Pritzker Military Library in downtown Chicago. It is made possible by the members of the Pritzker Military Library and the Union League Club of Chicago. Later on, we'll be taking questions from our studio audience and from those of you joining us on the internet at pritzkermilitarylibrary.org. Stanley McChrystal retired in July 2010 as a four-star general in the U.S. Army. His last assignment was as the commander of the International Security Assistance Force and as the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. He had previously served as the director of the Joint Staff and as commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. He is currently a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and the co-founder of the McChrystal Group, a leadership consulting firm. He joins us to discuss his new memoir, My Share of the Task, which chronicles his journey from the United States Military Academy to the command of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Please join me in welcoming to the Pritzker Military Library, General Stanley McChrystal.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I appreciate the chance to be with you here tonight. My father was a soldier, and his father before him. And all my life, I wanted to be a soldier. From the earliest age I can remember, I wanted not only to be a soldier, but I wanted to be an infantryman because that's what my father and grandfather had been. That was my idea of serving and what I should do. More specifically, I wanted to be a leader. And I saw myself as being in positions where I might lead soldiers and contribute to something that seemed important. And of course, the books that I read and the movies that I saw when I was young all reinforced this from the heroes of our nation and from other nations that I admired for many years. Often people ask me what leader most impacted me in my career, most caused me to lead the way I lead, caused me to think the way I think. And it's probably not as obvious because it took me quite a while to think about the people who affected me, and there were countless ones. But I'd like to talk about one in particular tonight. In June 2006, in the early evening, I was in a headquarters that we had established at a place called Balad Airfield in Iraq. And the sun was just setting, and I was waiting in an operations room that we operated in. And a task force commander that worked for me came in and said, "Sir, we're ready. He's here." And we walked out. It was an old Yugoslavian-built bunker that the Iraqis used for fighter planes, protection for fighter planes. And in the invasion, it had had holes put in it by American smart munitions. We had turned it into an area in which we operated our Special Operations Task Force out of. And so it had an area, one end of a command center I operated in, then had a large floor where we had a bigger operations center with screens and a number of people who operated disciplines of intelligence, communications, and all the things to do operations. But the individual who came to grab me, I'd served with for many years, and we'd been working very closely together. And he said, "Sir, we can go out this way." And we walked out through the operations center, and we walked out across, out into what was a warm Iraq evening. And we walked across some gravel and into a facility where we screened people who'd been detained. We walked through the area where the analysts work. We walked through work tables where computers, telephones, documents were triaged and then analyzed for intelligence. And we walked back to a room that had this is a very simple metal-walled building and had cement floors. And on the cement floor there was a poncho, a plasticized military poncho designed to keep the rain off you. And on it lay an individual, and he was dead. And about 2 hours before, I'd given the order to kill him. And he lay on the poncho face up, no visible injuries, nothing had broken the skin, dressed in all black. On the other side of him was a non-commissioned officer that I'd known for many years, and he was kneeling down and he was going through some of the personal equipment that the individual had on his body. I'd been in pursuit of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who lay in front of me now, for over 2.5 years. And as I looked at the non-commissioned officer who was kneeling on the other side, he had also been in combat against Zarqawi for all that time, and we'd known each other for many years. And as I looked at him, I just gave him a quizzical look, and I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Oh, sir, it's him," because positive identification was key. And it caused me to think. 19 years earlier, in August of 2007, I'd been still a relatively young major in 3rd Ranger Battalion. And we were sent to Egypt to do a training exercise with Egyptian commandos. And when we got there, I was the advanced party, so I was sent early, and we're camping in this area in the desert near an Egyptian airfield. And we're setting up, coordinating what the exercise is going to entail. And I'm having a difficult time doing some of the coordination because the interpreter I'd been given was an American who'd been through language school, but just wasn't really as proficient as would have been helpful. And a local Special Forces unit, 5th Special Forces unit, lent me a young sergeant who worked for them. And they said, "This guy's really good. He's an Egyptian who came to the U.S., married an American, became an American citizen, and he can really help you out." He was a supply sergeant. But he was a very impressive guy. He was very athletic. He was very affable. He was very self-confident. And for about 3 days, he helped me with coordination. We'd go places, and he could deal with the Egyptian military much more effectively, certainly than I could have alone. And then one day we were walking down the hallway of the Egyptian Commando Brigade headquarters, and we passed a couple of Egyptian majors, commando majors, and he greeted them like old friends. And they were friendly, but they were a bit standoffish. And I was surprised, and I looked at him, I said, "What was that about?" He said, "I used to be in this brigade." We went to a meeting with the colonel, concluded the meeting with the colonel, and the next day the sergeant disappeared. The Egyptians had asked the United States government to send him out of Egypt, out of the thing, and back to the United States. No explanation. I asked the commander, and he said, "No big deal." I never saw him again. That was 1987. After the bombings in East Africa in the summer of 1998, that interpreter, a man named Ali Muhammad, who had been a sergeant in American Special Forces, was investigated and later arrested for being a member of Al-Qaeda. And he was a fairly boastful guy, but he boasted about how important he was to the Al-Qaeda network. And so although in the summer of '87, Al-Qaeda's formation was still a year in the future, 1988 in Peshawar, Pakistan, I'd had my first interaction with what was going to be an Al-Qaeda leader. I didn't know it at the time, but I started an intersection with Al-Qaeda that impacted my life. Now, the person who impacted it most was the person who in the summer of 2006 lay dead in front of me. But in fact, as I realized later, we'd had a parallel path that impacted me, my life, my career, and how I lead in an extraordinary way. In the summer of 1987, when I was in Egypt, this young Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, not known as that then, that's a kunya he adopted later, which means Abu, father of Musab, or father of Musab from Zarqa, an industrial town in Jordan. He was still a young guy who was very interested in going to join the Mujahideen's fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And he went there in 1989 to join this, but he got there too late. The war was essentially over, and he spent a little time as a journalist, but he got got interested, and then he came back to Jordan. From 1989 to the 1990s, you remember some things happened during the 90s. I left the Rangers, the first Gulf War happened. And I went to the first Gulf War, and for me it was a military experience. But a lot of people don't realize that at the beginning of that war, when Iraq initially invaded Kuwait, Saudi Arabia received 2 offers of help to defend Saudi Arabia. One from the United States, who came and said, we'd like to deploy a large force to first defend Saudi Arabia, and then it was ultimately used to free Kuwait. But also, Osama bin Laden offered to raise a force of 100,000 fighters, mujahideen, many of whom would have been veterans of Afghanistan, to come do the job without asking foreigners to help. Of course, Saudi leadership selected the Americans, and it created in Osama bin Laden a burning resentment that added to other frustrations. And so it started to continue the radicalization of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. And I went on with my career in the 1990s. I went on to command a battalion in the 82nd Airborne Division. I was lucky enough to then command a battalion in the Rangers. I was able to spend a year at Harvard, and then I got to command the Ranger Regiment. So the 1990s for me were one of really opportunities to become a more professional soldier, levels of leadership that gave me a tremendous amount of experience. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi went home to Jordan when he left Afghanistan. He operated a few years, started to have some problems, and he had been sort of a tough as a young man. He'd gotten into some troubles with the police. He'd had some troubles with alcohol and drugs and whatnot. But he got thrown in prison in 1994 by the Jordanians. And he was kept in prison for 5 years. And in prison for 5 years, and I don't want to draw the comparison too tightly, he became professionalized. He became a very effective, charismatic leader. His religious beliefs were sharpened or focused by a guy named Makdisi, who was a cleric in prison with him. But Zarqawi became a very important informal leader in prison. There's one description by another prisoner who said he could simply turn his eyes and cause people to do things. He had the tattoos he'd had put on in his youth. He had them removed with acid. And he became a harder and harder guy. So in 1999, I left the decade of the 90s. I spent my last year in New York City in the Council on Foreign Relations. After having given up command of the Rangers, he left prison. He came out of prison focused on a more extreme participation in what he now saw as global jihad. He was not al-Qaeda at the time. He was allied and associated with al-Qaeda, but he was not. He then went back to Afghanistan, and he was in Afghanistan in the early 2000 period up until 9/11. And then when the American response to 9/11 came, he managed to escape. He'd been running a terrorist training camp in an area in western Afghanistan, Herat, but he managed to escape. He was now focused on becoming a terrorist leader and a very effective professional one. He was 12 years younger than me, but he was becoming what was going to be a very credible threat. He showed up in 2003 in Iraq, before the invasion of Iraq, and he was experimenting with chemical and biological weapons that he would, the reporting that we had at the time, he'd spread them on animals to see if they would kill them in the hopes that he could use that to kill foreign forces later. So with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, he disappears a bit. We knew he was in Iraq beforehand, but then when the invasion comes, the area, Kermal, where he had been operating, a force was sent there, and he wasn't there, although there was a camp there that he had been involved with. And he goes a little bit off the radar screen. Meanwhile, I go to Afghanistan in 2002, my first tour there. Then I come back in the Pentagon, and I'm working in the Pentagon during the initial invasion of Iraq. And then in the fall of 2003, I'm designated to command Joint Special Operations Command and also a task force called Task Force 714, which operated our most elite counterterrorist forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, and some other areas in the region. And the mission is to go after senior al-Qaeda leadership, but also initially after senior former regime elements under Saddam Hussein. So in the fall of 2003, October, I arrive into Iraq in charge of this task force. And there have just been a couple of big terrorist events. Attack on UN headquarters, attack on the Jordanian embassy. But we weren't sure in Iraq when I arrived that al-Qaeda was the problem. It seemed as though Saddam Hussein was the problem. Most of us can remember that, and his Ba'athist former generals were the problem. And the hope was that if we could just capture Saddam Hussein and get the deck of cards guys, that we'd solve the problem. We did that. My force pursued Saddam Hussein. In December, we captured Saddam Hussein, and for a very short period, about 2 weeks, we patted ourselves on the back and said, maybe this is going to solve the problem, and maybe Iraq will move forward now. But right at the end of December, very first part of January in 2004, we captured intelligence that confirmed that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was not only in Iraq, he had been building a network, a terrorist network, that did several things. One, it leveraged expertise of foreign terrorist leaders, and it also leveraged the Sunnis who were terrified in Iraq at that point that with the fall of the Saddam government, Sunnis were now going to be dispossessed and in fact in great danger. So he leveraged the frustration in much of the Sunni population in Iraq, and he was able to ally those two and tie them together into an organization that initially we called al-Qaeda in Iraq. It technically wasn't that because it was a year or so before Abu Musab al-Zarqawi formally joined al-Qaeda, but for all intents and purposes, he had become al-Qaeda's network leader in Iraq. Now, I grew up in an era when going after terrorists was something like out of the movies. Terrorist groups were these bounded organizations, Black September, things like that. There's a certain number of them. And movies like Die Hard, you can pick them out. They're sort of iconic and stereotypical. And if you get them all, you win. Well, that's not what al-Qaeda's like. It's like a cancer, a network. And it's got people full-time, part-time. It's like a classic guerrilla network because it's essentially a global insurgency leveraging an idea and building on people's frustrations. And that's exactly what Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was doing. So in January of 2004, I'm a major general commanding a task force, been in the Army 28 years. I'm in a job that I think I am prepared for, but it's different. The challenge is different. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi is now running a terrorist network bigger than anything he had dreamed of. And in fact, very quickly, he becomes al-Qaeda's main effort because Iraq, although al-Qaeda didn't plan it to be, Iraq became their main theater of effort from about 2004 until about 2009. In February of 2004, I went on a mission with one of my forces. I'd go on missions periodically as anyone does. I went on a mission with a force to capture Zarqawi. We thought we had a good location on him in a place called Fallujah. And we went into Fallujah. This is before Fallujah melted down and we had the battles of Fallujah 1 and 2. We went on a mission. We got around the block. As we went, our assault force went into the house. Later, we're told we didn't capture him. If we did, history would have been different. Later, we're told he jumped out a window. We can't confirm that. We're not sure he was ever there. Our intel was right. But potentially, we had an intersection where we could have nipped this at the bud and didn't. But at the time, we just didn't have, as yet, he was important, but we didn't have an appreciation for what he was going to be. Okay, so what happened from the spring of 2004 until June of 2006? Abu Musab al-Zarqawi created a network across Iraq that included communications, logistics, funding, recruiting, technology, which means building car bombs and things, direct operations, assassinations, and more than anything else, and very effectively, propaganda or information operations. He created all of those things, and he created it out of a combination of foreign leaders that he brought in and Iraqi leaders. You remember when we de-Baathified and we disbanded the Iraqi army, we put out of work a tremendous number of people who now had no income, now had nowhere to go. They had a lot of training, and many of them were very, very frustrated, and they became members of this al-Qaeda network. Whether they had the same religious extremist beliefs or not, it didn't matter. They joined it because it was a resistance to the Americans and a resistance to the Shia-dominated government of Iraq. So it was almost masterful, and you say, okay, this is a terrorist leader, and we captured information about him. We knew how he was operating at times. We got close to him a couple of times, and I'll describe that. But as he put together this network, he was putting it together in a very effective way. One, he empowered local leaders. He would go around the battlefield, and you'd get reports of him sitting down, very self-effacing, very quiet. He'd sit down and listen to their problems. He'd motivate them. We captured a recording one time that he did, and they put out over the internet. And what he did was he praised groups around the country. He would describe a town or a neighborhood, and he'd say, "To the Lions of Samara, you are doing great work. I salute you. To the heroes of Baqaba." And as we listened to that, one of the officers that I worked with said, "This is genius. He's going by township." And think about it. If you are a small terrorist organization hiding in basements or operating in the ways you have to operate, and suddenly the supreme leader of your organization recognizes you publicly and does it in a way that everybody else hears, it's like seeing your name on the front page of the newspaper saying good things about you. It's very motivational. He also did some things that built up his own bona fides as a terrorist leader. We captured in the spring of 2006, we captured a video that he put out. And we captured the full uncut version. And in it, he's at a firing range. He's at an area with berms and whatnot. And he's dressed in all black with a bandana on his head. And he's got an American M249 squad automatic weapon. And he's shooting it. And he stands up there, and it's a pretty macho thing. And the design is that he's going to look like, he does in the thing, he looks like a great terrorist fighter leader. Well, we captured the unedited version, and in that one, he's firing it for a while, and then when it jams, he doesn't know how to unjam it, so somebody's got to get it. And then when he's finished with it, he hands it to one of his comrades, and as they're walking away, the comrade hands it to another guy who grabs it by the barrel, which is white hot. So when he put out his propaganda video, we immediately put out the full version so people could get the rest of the story. But he was good at this stuff. He was really good at leveraging people's fears, leveraging their aspirations, leveraging their hopes as we went forward. So what we found is, instead of, I had a task force that was created to respond to terrorist incidents. I had first been in the task force, was created in the wake of the failure of the Iranian rescue mission, Eagle Claw, in April of 1980. And it was designed to be able to do those things that Americans felt like we couldn't do well enough. Respond to hijackings, hostage rescue, and places like that. It was designed to do periodic, not often, very precise, complex missions. And that's the way we operated. When I was younger, we would do an operation every few months. You get intel, you rehearse a long time, you get approvals at the highest level, you do this mission, and then you come back. And when we first got into Iraq, when I took over in October 2003, and the area's starting to get bad, we go after what we call high-value targets. And those high-value targets are leaders first of Saddam's cronies, but then they start to be Saddam Hussein's. And we go, and the theory is if we go take the key leaders out of the organization, it will collapse. Decapitation. And I respond to people as I think about it now. You know, if you think about it, if you take the top 1 or 2 people out of an organization, does it collapse? I joke that if you'd done that in the Pentagon, it'd have got better. I didn't joke that at the time. Now that I'm retired, I do. But think about it. It wasn't the strategy that would work. So what we had to do was we had to destroy his network. If you think about destroying something that works, you got to get the people who actually do the work. You can't get the people who just send out the orders. You got to get the people who build the car bombs, people who do the communications, people who handle the financing, people who do the recruiting, all the middle managers who really make any organization work. And we had to identify it, understand it, and we had to then destroy it. And so as we started to spread out to understand it, we realized that we weren't a network. My force was a group of little organizations around the country. We had communications with each other, but in fact our guys in Mosul are fighting their war, our guys in Samar are fighting their war, small teams, they're doing great work, but we're all doing separate things. And yet the enemy's built a network and they're doing one thing. And we realized we had to become that network and we had to be better than they were. Now if you think about it, it says great, become a network, that's easy. That's not the way military organizations are culturally set up. Military's culturally hierarchical. Networks have got to be flatter, much less centralized decision making, much more agility, much more allowing people to do what they have to do in their area. And so we not only had to create a network, we had to overturn our culture, starting with me. Suddenly, we had to create an organization that's not just a bunch of big knuckle commandos that I'd grown up with, but you had to have old guys, young women, civilians from all our intel agencies, from Department of State, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of the Treasury, people you never knew you needed their expertise, but that's what you needed if you want to understand something. So we bring them all in and say, that's easy. Bring all these people in and we'll form this cohesive team. Think about that. We got the big knuckle commandos who kind of sit there, taciturn sort of guys, and suddenly we got a 22-year-old female intel analyst, 88 pounds soaking wet, but she's the expert. And I come in and she's leaning across the table with her finger in the chest of this guy who's about 190, 200 pounds, and he's listening to her. And when we started to get there, I realized we were changing our culture. We were becoming a meritocracy for the task at hand. And we had to share information in ways. You know, you used to have a culture that who needs to know? But we had to change our culture with who doesn't know? We need to tell them right now. A culture of secrecy had to go away to a culture of openness. Within this task force that it created was actually many thousands of people. So we are changing. As Zarqawi is building up this network, we are changing to become a network, and in that process, we are changing ourselves. I no longer had a private office. I now worked right in an open floor with all the guys. When I made a phone call, I just put it on speaker and talked. And everybody around me, all my staff people all around all the time. The problem with that as a senior leader is you spend most of your life being a senior leader so you can have a corner office and you can do whatever you want. And then suddenly I get to be a senior leader. One, I'm in this bunker. There are no corners. And two, none of those perks are going to let me get the job done. Instead, I got to sit among everybody and I got to show everybody how smart I am or how smart I'm not. And I've got to empower people. Spend life getting power, and then you get to that level and you got to give it all away. Because that's what's going to work. The operation, as we started to create this network, our mantra became, it takes a network to defeat a network. And we hammered that every day. And my role as a leader became, make the network work. Make collaboration happen. I didn't approve specific operations. I didn't have to. And we started to accelerate. I mentioned we did one every few months when I was younger. In August of 2004, I'd been in command about 10 months. We did 18 raids in that month. About every other night. And I thought, we are smoking. This is it. This is the fastest anyone's ever done. And we're extraordinarily effective in these raids. But we're losing. It's still getting worse. and our contribution to the war effort to break al-Qaeda, we're behind the problem. 2 years later, in August of 2006, we're doing 300 raids a month, 10 a night. And we kept that up for 2.5 years. Now, when you operate once every few months, you can operate in one way. You can be kind of deliberate, you can be kind of centralized. When you operate every other night, you got to speed up, but you still can do that. You just got to work hard. When you operate 300 a month, 10 a night, it's completely different. Everything has to be flat. The rules have got to change dramatically. Your forces have got not only to operate on their own, but they've got to constantly interact because intelligence has to interact. When I first took over, we'd do an operation, a raid force would hit a target, and they'd capture somebody. And that person would be flown, they'd be held at the local area for 24 hours or so, and then be flown to a bigger detention center. And the equipment and things that were captured with them, documents, phones, computers, would typically be put either in a sandbag or in a plastic trash bag. And there'd be a little post-it stuck on there. We captured this date here. And that would come back. And when I first took over, I went to our detention facility where we also looked at all those materials, and there was a room and there were these bags piled that hadn't even been opened because we didn't have enough translators, we didn't have enough intelligence analysts, we didn't have the capacity to digest it. So we've got guys out there risking their lives to get intelligence, and then it's sitting there because we can't do anything with it. So as part of becoming a network, we had to become a machine. We had to become an eating machine, eating intelligence. And when you eat intelligence, and you got to push that intelligence out immediately. What would happen in the first part when I took over, it might take days or weeks for us to get intelligence, digest it, determine, oh yeah, here's another target, and go. And usually by that time, the individual had realized his buddy had been captured or killed, and clearly he changed what he was doing. By 2006 and 2007, we could do that turn 3 times in a single night. We could capture person A, digest that information, and on that learn a B, hit B, do the same, and go to C. It was about speed, but it was really about who learns fastest. Which organization can digest information, act on it, and not get itself caught in its own bureaucracy. By the spring of 2006, we're very much become a network. We're not perfect yet, and we went a long way more. I stayed in command for just under 5 years. But in the spring of 2006, just about that time, we captured the video I mentioned. We also did an operation. One of our intelligence NCOs had been watching a target using Predator as often as we had an extra thing. He'd been watching this location west of Baghdad in an area called Yusufia, and he just knew something was going on there. And so we hit a target not too far from it, several kilometers away that night, killed 4 enemy, a successful operation, captured some stuff. While that's happening, he's got an asset watching the other target, and he sees people gathering there. And he says, we got to hit the other target. We took the raid force, which had just finished a firefight, recocked them, and 2 hours after they hit the first one, they hit the second target, and they captured 12 Iraqi middle-aged males and 1 cell phone. And now in Iraq, if you capture 12 middle-aged males and there's only 1 cell phone, something's wrong. Normally there's about 20. And so they either didn't bring them, or they threw them into a canal behind this house. So that's a red flag first, and then they're not farmers, and yet they're out in largely a rural area. And so what we identified was this was different. This was sub-commanders. We brought them in and we started sorting them out, and over the next days and weeks, as we interrogated and worked the intelligence in each, we first thought certain ones of them were very important. Then over time, our interest focused more and more to one guy, who I'll refer to as Mubassir. And we began to feel that he knew a lot, but he wouldn't cooperate. And we kept him for a significant number of days, and the interrogators we had working with him, we didn't abuse people. The way you get them to cooperate is to talk to them hour after hour, take on their misperceptions about Americans. The best thing you can do when you bring someone in who's been told that the Americans are going to torture you is not torture them, because it's a disconnect. The thing that hurt us more than anything else in the whole decade was Abu Ghraib, because it convinced the whole region that what they thought about us was true. Whether we think that wasn't, I know it wasn't reflective of normal behavior, but it met preconceptions, it confirmed them. So what we did is we talked to them. We even had two of the interrogators built up a relationship, even had movie night with Mubasser one night. Okay, let's take a break, let's watch a movie. What do you want to watch? And the three of them together watched the movie he selected, his favorite, which was The Exorcist. Hey, you can't make this stuff up. That's why. And they do from day after day, and finally we're watching his brother. We figure out who his brother, he tells us who his brother is, and we're watching his brother dashes to Syria. And now he's worried because his brother can't be protected. And so finally we said, okay, we can't hold off. We're going to put you in the main detention facility, the prison system. And once you're in that, you know, you go into the legal system and whatnot. We said, you got to cooperate with us, or that's what happens. And one of our two interrogators walks out and says, okay, I'm going to go get the guard. The other interrogator looks at him and says, hey, you gotta work with us, or we can't help you. And he says, I can't help you. She gets up, walks to the door, and he goes, wait, I got something to tell you. Now, what he told them was that he knew who Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's spiritual advisor was, and that spiritual advisor met with Zarqawi on a regular basis, every week to 10 days. That was the first person we'd ever been told had regular face-to-face interaction with Zarqawi that could be predicted, i.e. if we could find him and follow him, we could go and we could locate Zarqawi. So we began, we identified him, we found where he lived in Baghdad, and we watched him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it took a lot of our assets, our Predators, our manned aircraft, ground surveillance people, and it was really tough because while you're doing this, Baghdad was exploding. You remember in the summer of 2006, it was going crazy with violence. So everything we put on this was something we couldn't put to help stop other violence very near term. So there's a lot of pressure. We've got one group, intelligence group, saying we got to stay focused, we got to do this. We've got other groups saying, hey, we need those assets. Let's just pick the guy up and see if he'll talk. But we had one non-commissioned officer, Master Sergeant, kind of a dumpy looking guy who'd grown up in North Carolina, Southern voice, very soft-spoken, but brilliant. And he's like a dog on a bone. He knows the subject, and he says, we've got to stay on this. And so for day after day, we watch this, and we have a conversation about every other day. Do we go on and strike, or do we wait? Then one day, we've been told to know what predictive behavior, if the Sheikh Abdul Rahman was the spiritual advisor's name, if he moved his family to another location, to a friend's house for safekeeping, that meant he was going to go visit Zarqawi. Well, one day we saw him do that. Immediately, red flags go up. So we're watching as close as we can. The next day he gets out and he's got a driver who drives him around, which wasn't uncommon there. And he gets out in the morning, he gets in the car in Baghdad and he drives and he does this big loop and he comes back to the house. We're leaning forward on the blocks like this, and he comes back and everybody goes, what's up with this? Clearly he was trying to see if he was being followed. He left a little while later and started driving. And they came in and grabbed me. The guys are watching it all the time, and I'm about 20 feet away, and they come and they said, hey, sir, he's driving, he's moving. I said, great. And they said, he's moving north. And I said, what? I think he's going to move west. They said, he's moving north. Well, I've learned I'm a bad judge of what's going to happen, so I said, okay. So we follow him north, and he goes up on a divided highway in his car, and suddenly he pulls off to the side, and the driver lets him out, and the car drives away. And he's standing on the shoulder of the road with his cell phone. And about 20 seconds later, a blue truck comes up, picks him up. It's tradecraft, it's counter surveillance, and we said, wow, that's impressive. Then he went north to a place called Baqaba, and he went to a corner building, which is a small restaurant, cafe. And he went in there, and there were several pickup trucks out front, all looked the same, all painted the same. And he went in there, came out, and then he came out another door. A little while later, we thought about striking that cafe because we said that's where they're meeting. But the intel sergeant said, no, don't, that's not it. A little while later, he comes out and he gets in one of the trucks, and The trucks all leave. 2 of them go in other directions, and fortunately, our guys have gotten good enough watching him from a predator. They say, that's him. They can tell him as he walks. And we follow that truck. We actually followed all the trucks, but we followed that one knowing he was in it. And when he went up to a place that was like a suburb, a series of houses along a small road and a canal, behind them of which is a big palm grove. And he goes in the house, and then a guy comes out and meets him. Then a little while later, the guy who met him walks back out, walks down the length of the driveway. The guy's dressed in all black, looks like Johnny Cash. Walks the length of the driveway, gets to the road, looks left and right. And the guys come and grab me immediately, and they said, you got to see this. It happened about 2 minutes before. And they replay it because we recorded everything, and I go, that's Zarqawi. And they look at me, Ed, no shit, boss. And we launched a raid force, but predictably, whenever you need it, one of the helicopters breaks, which is what happened, delayed them a little bit. And we made the decision we had to bomb. We made the decision to kill him. We did, and within 2 hours, I was standing over his corpse in our headquarters. Now, to tie this together, you know, typically you say, who affected me as a leader? And I could go and I could say my father, I could say my 1st battalion commander, or I could say a mentor, John Abizaid. And there were a lot of people who changed the way I thought about leadership and actually changed the way I led. But Zarqawi probably did it more than anyone else. I don't think he knew he was doing it. He certainly wasn't trying to help me. But he was the forcing function that forced me to change as a leader, forced me to think about how not only to fight, but how to lead. And at the end of the day, it's amazing how those things come around. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
General, first I would like to thank you for your 34 years of service.
Thank you, ma'am.
Granted, none of us are seers into the future. What do you think is going to happen in that area?
Yes, ma'am. If I can widen it to the whole Mideast region, I think what's going to happen is what started, you know, we had 9/11, and it focused America in the region again. And we made a lot of mistakes. When we went into Afghanistan and then Iraq, we didn't know enough. It was like doing a business deal without doing enough due diligence. We didn't understand enough. We didn't do enough language work. We didn't know enough. Good intentions, but we learned some hard lessons. We learned during it. But one of the things that I learned during it, to state the obvious, is how complex it is. But there are certain overarching themes which are going to affect the way things go. The first is frustration. The thing that Al-Qaeda and other leaders leverage is 2 words, humiliation and frustration. And those are held by significant parts of the population, a lack of political opportunity, economic opportunity, and personal opportunity. A young person who doesn't have a job in North Africa can't get married. And so if you can't get married, it's hard to have the kind of life that's fulfilling. So frustration and humiliation are leveraged by leaders. Al-Qaeda is a political movement wrapped in a religious cape. But that's the first thing. It's that frustration that we've got to understand. The second is there have been a bunch of autocratic regimes which have kept a lid on a pressure cooker in the region really for many years. But if you go back to 1967, that was a big inflection point. With the failure of pan-Arab nationalism, you had 2 things happen. You had a rise of extremism, frustration, and you had some regimes which kept things a lid on them. Now, in some way, we have mixed feelings about those regimes. They were difficult on their people, but they provided stability for the region. And in many ways, we in the West benefited from that stability. Think what Mubarak and Egypt provided in terms of stability for Israel and the West. Yet, think of the cost to many parts of the Egyptian population. So it's a contradictory thing. And so the Arab Spring, which starts, is just page 1. That started tectonic plates moving, which haven't even, they're not close to being over. Those movements are partway. And then the Sunni-Shia friction. I think if you look at the fault line between Sunni and Shia Islam, and you draw a line sort of at Egypt, and you arc through Lebanon, down through Syria, which we're seeing as the hottest point right now, and potentially all the way down into the Gulf, where Iran and Saudi Arabia, and of course Saudi Arabia's got 15% Shia as a minority in the east, there is a friction line that, in my sense, is going to be a big story for the next 10 or 20 years. It's going to be a friction point. What happens in Syria, I think, is going to be more difficult than many people hope. I don't think we're suddenly going to have the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime and then suddenly a replacement regime. We're likely to have this group of groups who keep fighting over it. And so the Sunni-Shia backdrop in that has got to be something we've got to stay conscious to. So I think those big themes are going to be really key. Thank you, ma'am.
General, I found your discussion tonight most interesting and intriguing. My question to you is, to what extent was your search for al-Zarqawi a parallel kind of situation relative to the search for Osama bin Laden? And if you've seen the movie, to what extent do you think Zero Dark 30 was a reasonably accurate depiction of what went on?
Yeah. The parallels are very significant. First, Osama bin Laden was always the ultimate. My force spent that decade going after him, but he was harder to get at and very hard to locate. Zarqawi would be the equivalent of his most active field general. This is the guy, Osama bin Laden's the iconic leader giving general guidance. Zarqawi's the guy out there making it happen in Iraq. He's the one starting a forest fire that you got to deal with. But there are a lot of parallels. The first is, it's not anything different from very difficult police work. At the end, it's an intelligence fight. I saw Zero Dark 30. The great thing about that movie is it gives you a sense of a decade of hundreds and thousands of people. And I know they create a few characters that are focused on, but in reality, there are hundreds and thousands of people focusing, trying to pull every thread together. We really didn't get effective against Zarqawi until we learned to network, until we learned you can't have 15 or 20 different agencies each trying to be the most effective. You have to, everybody's got to let go of the side of the pool, cut down their walls, and actually spread information. I think that's what happened in the hunt for Osama bin Laden as well. I think that over time, the organizations grew closer and closer because they had to, and they began to share information, which allows you to build. It allows you to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Also, we started to develop a cadre of people who'd been at it long enough where they knew enough to know what the pieces meant. I would argue that even though there was a small part of our intelligence community focused in 2001 on UBL and others, in reality, we knew so little that it's like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle when you don't know what the picture that's coming out is. Later, first in Iraq and then later for Osama bin Laden, we started to know what that picture looked like, and then you could pull those pieces together. I actually thought Zero Dark 30, there were a couple things about it that I think were movieized, but for the most part, I thought it was thematically very good. And I thought the depiction of the raid at the end, the fact that it was not overly dramatic and nobody rolled through a window and threw a hand grenade through their legs and that sort of thing, you know, because no one does that twice. I went on a whole bunch of similar operations, and that had it had a very real feel to it. So I thought they did a good job on that. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, sir, so much for coming this evening and sharing your experiences. I'm the spouse of a Vietnam veteran, different kind of war, mom of a OIF, OEF veteran. I'm reading a book, and it's about trauma for veterans. And a significant portion of part of the book is about saving hearts and minds. And I was wondering if you could speak about that portion of our experience there.
Yes, ma'am. And first, thanks for your sacrifice. And I mean, it's amazing. People don't understand everybody who sacrifices to do what the nation does, so thank you. I think you're right. You know, it's funny, trauma, there's physical trauma and then there's mental trauma, and sometimes they're together. And there are a lot of veterans in this room, and as you know, physical trauma is something that is scary, but you can at least see it. You know it when it happens. Even a concussion you can see on medical testing. Mental trauma is much harder because it's cumulative. My experience is it's not one single event, it's cumulative. It's like courage. People say the more you fight, the more courageous you get. That's really not my experience. My experience is the more you fight, courage is something that drains a little bit because it takes out of you. And I think trauma is like that, particularly on young people in a war that's very difficult to understand, because the reinforcement that comes, you know, we have sort of a macho culture. We can't help it. In one way it's good, in one way it's bad. You know, somebody gets hurt and you say, "How you doing, soldier?" They go, "I'm fine, sir." Whether they're fine or not. You want them to say that. You don't want them to start crying and whining, but you don't want to take them at their word either. You want to say, "Hey, you have been through a lot, and we got to think about that." And so we got to get a culture, and I think we've made a lot of progress in it, that first says everybody who goes through it's impacted. I don't care who you are. You're not the same when you come out. And so we're going to have to deal with that. No matter whether you don't feel it, nobody can see it, you got to deal with that. So I think we got to do it. And then we've got to, it's very hard, and I know Vietnam veterans went through this more than any other war in our history. People didn't value what they did. I mean, they knew what they did, and they valued it, and it was honorable, and it was courageous. But then you had part of America that said, "That was a waste of your time." Well, you know, the most dangerous thing, I think, to any of our veterans now would be to be told, "You served, and it was a waste of your time." It's really, I mean, I know when people tell me that, yeah, you did all that, utterly pointless. And I don't believe that, but that's probably the most discouraging thing to hear. And so I think that's one of the things, whether or not we politically agree with the war or not, what our service members did, it's not a waste of their time. And they make a big contribution. So I think it's really important we value that. Thanks.
We have time for one more question.
I'm sorry.
Might get cut off, so.
Okay. General, thank you for your service, obviously. You talked about fault lines. Do you think there is a fault line between the Taliban as an indigenous group and Al-Qaeda as an international group, and that some arrangement could be made to allow the Taliban to work things out with the Afghan government without Al-Qaeda using Afghanistan as a base?
Yes, sir, I do. I think we saw that about 3 years ago. Taliban has got to the point where Al-Qaeda is now a liability for them. It makes them not seem like a nationalist group that can deal inside the country. No one in Afghanistan likes Al-Qaeda. Most of them don't like the Taliban. They particularly don't like the Taliban if Al-Qaeda is involved. So that's a fault line. There are also fault lines inside the Taliban. They are not a monolithic, tight organization. There are a bunch of different groups, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there as well. Thanks, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you very much. Our thanks to General McChrystal for joining us. The book is My Share of the Task, published by Penguin Group. Special thanks to members of the Pritzker Military Library and the Union League Club of Chicago for making this program possible. You can learn more about the library, download the audio podcast, or view other archive programs by visiting pritzkermilitarylibrary.org. Please join us next time on Pritzker Military Library Presents. Thank you.
The views and opinions expressed in this program are not necessarily those of the library. The Pritzker Military Library Presents is made possible by members of the library and its sponsors. If you would like to be a part of our studio audience or learn more, visit pritzkermilitarylibrary.org. This Jumpmaster production is presented in association with the Pritzker Military Library.